Good day. This program is about the situation in Ukraine, as all my recent videos have been. And I'm not going to apologize this time for discussing Ukraine because the developments there are becoming increasingly dramatic. In fact, they're now developing an accelerated tempo. Now, the first thing to say is that the surrender of the Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal factory in Mariupol, the last holdout of the Ukrainian forces on the Sea of Azov and in Mariupol, this continues. The Russians claim that around 960 men who were in the Azovstal factory have now surrendered, have now given themselves up to the Russian and militia forces that have surrounded the factory and which have been besieging it for some time. Now, one point I would make is that the fact that these troops, these Ukrainian troops, are surrendering in dribs and drabs, some at a time, rather than all of them coming out at once, does beg a number of questions. Firstly, is it the case that this is an organized decision? This is an actual decision by the Ukrainian command to avoid the pictures of a mass surrender that might happen if all of the troops in the factory gave up together. It's possible. However, another possibility is that there's still dissension and argument amongst some of these troops in the Azovstal factory about whether to surrender or not. And what we're seeing is not the kind of organized surrender that Ukraine has been talking about, but perhaps a gradual disintegration of the force in Azovstal, of soldiers finally deciding that they've had enough and are going to surrender irrespective of whatever orders, either to surrender or not, that they're being given. And if that is the case, that might explain the fact that they're coming out in dribs and drabs, and it might also lead to the outcome which I discussed yesterday, which is that a few fervid souls decide to hold out in the factory after everyone else has gone, in which case, of course, the Russians and their allied forces will have to clear them out. And that will be, I suspect, a rather desperate and lonely fight in the caverns beneath the factory. Anyway, one way or the other, this battle is over. And over the course of the day, as it's become increasingly clear that the Russians have made no commitments to exchange these prisoners for anyone at all held by Ukraine, or have made any promises or given any undertakings that these people will be returned to Ukraine or sent to Ukraine. Increasingly, the Western media has rather grudgingly adjusted to this fact and is now accepting that what has happened is a capitulation. It is a surrender. It was always that. There were never any grounds for calling it anything else. And I think I have to say this. I think it is a sad comment on Western media coverage of the war in Ukraine that this collapse in Azovstal was misreported in that grotesque way we saw yesterday, in the early reports yesterday and the day before, when it was absurdly referred to as some kind of government-ordered evacuation, presumably to Ukrainian territory. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation in Azovstal. Elsewhere in Donbass, we are now getting more and more reports of settlements and villages falling under Russian or Allied control at an intensifying and accelerated pace. And we're getting information, by the way, of more and more Ukrainian soldiers handing themselves in, and also of the troops, the Ukrainian troops in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation now being in effect surrounded in another sort of cauldron. And these are dramatic developments. The number of troops who are Ukrainian troops who are surrounded in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is open to some discussion. It's been suggested that there's 8,000 there. Others put the figure much higher at 17,000. I'm not going to try and guess. I'm not in any kind of position to guess or to speculate about this. But what is beyond question is, as I said, is that these troops are apparently in effect trapped. There are rumours, and I want to stress again that they are only rumours, and they appear to originate from Russian sources, which makes, of course, them rumours that one should certainly treat with great skepticism. But nonetheless, they're rumours which may be true and may be plausible, that there's been debate and argument within the Ukrainian High Command about what to do with the troops in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. Supposedly, the Ukrainian military leadership, the Ukrainian General Staff, asked the political leadership, headed by Zelensky, to order the retreat of these troops to Ukrainian lines further west. In other words, to abandon Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which have for some time been undefendable. But supposedly, President Zelensky and his political advisors again countermanded this decision. They apparently insisted that the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk hold out once more to the last man or to the last bullet, in the way in which the Ukrainian garrison in the Azovstal factory was supposed to do. I want to stress again, this is a rumor. I cannot corroborate it. Obviously, President Zelensky and his advisors and the Ukrainian General Staff do not share their discussions with me. So I don't know whether or not this is correct, but I have to say it is plausible. And the reason I say it is plausible is because it is consistent with my understanding of the whole situation in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. These troops are essentially surrounded. They are in effect trapped. They're cut off from resupply. There is no factory comparable to the Azovstal steelworks that they can retreat to. There's no bunker complex like the one underneath the Azovstal steelworks that they might be able to find. And it's much more difficult to see how they can put up the same kind of prolonged resistance that the garrison in the Azovstal factory was able to put up. Ordering these troops to remain in position simply traps them and leads to the inevitable collapse of the force in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and it in turn leads to the eventual surrender or capitulation of the garrison there. I don't understand the logic of this. It makes no sense to me. I know some people are saying that the determined resistance in Donbass is intended to buy Ukraine time, whilst Ukraine rearms in the west and in the central regions of Ukraine. I think this is a rationalization. I think that throwing away some of your best soldiers to achieve that kind of objective is misguided. I would have thought that even if you were intending to try and buy time by rearming, the right thing to do is to pull your troops back so that you have an army to fight with and your best soldiers to fight with, rather than to throw them away on such a strange and eccentric mission. But regardless and besides, we now have what looks to be an extremely credible report. It's backed by film from the Russians that some of this weaponry that the West has been sending to Ukraine is not making the kind of difference that some people in the West expected. Now, there's been a huge amount of discussion in the West about the supposed effectiveness of these American M777 howitzers. And there are some people who, for reasons I don't fully understand, but then I'm not a military person or a technical person, but they seem to think that these weapons, these artillery pieces, might be some sort of game changer. I don't see how. I am aware that some people think that US artillery has longer ranges than Russian artillery. I'm not even convinced that that's true, by the way. Certainly the specifications of the artillery that I've seen in public places, in public fora, the Russian and American artillery don't really seem to me to bear out that claim. And I think anyway that people are perhaps assuming that these artillery pieces are able to achieve these 40-kilometer distances with ordinary ammunition, whereas it seems to me that these sort of distances are only achievable with extended range ammunition, which requires complicated ranging instruments, and which is presumably rather expensive, and which Ukraine may not have been provided with. Certainly the M777 howitzers that I've seen, that have been seen in Ukraine, don't seem to be operating with the digital ranging systems that might have been expected. There's been much discussion as to why that is so. There's been suggestions that this has been done to prevent these systems, these ranging systems, falling into Russian hands. I think a more plausible explanation is that these howitzers have been rushed to the battlefronts, and there simply hasn't been the time to train the Ukrainian artillerymen to operate these howitzers with these digital ranging systems. Anyway, some of these howitzers have reached the battle lines, but the Russians have now convincingly shown a battery of these howitzers being destroyed by a Russian artillery strike. Apparently, they were detected by a drone. I suspect they'd already been detected through counter-battery radars and all these kind of things. But anyway, a Russian drone found them. It seems to have launched some sort of a missile at the battery. 2 of the howitzers were damaged. The Ukrainians pulled these howitzers into a wooded area in order to try to protect them. There was the predictable Russian artillery strike on this wooded area, and it seems as if this entire battery, 6, 12, I have no idea how many howitzers, has been destroyed. And it seems that they are not the kind of game changer in the battle that many people expected or were led to think. And in fact, as I said, all the reports are of more and more settlements and villages in Donbass now falling under Russian control, as the Ukrainian forces in Donbass have been ground down, and especially after the fall of the critically important town of Popasnaya around 10 days ago. I'm going to add, by the way, that there's also reports of a Russian breakthrough in the fortified lines opposite Donetsk. This has been perhaps the most heavily defended area of the battlefront, of the Ukrainian battlefront, but there's some reports that the East Ukrainian militia, the Donbass militia, has actually now managed to break through some of these lines, and that the Ukrainian position in this part of the Donbass is also now experiencing severe problems. And there's also apparently been some sort of encounter battle further south in Zaporozhye. It seems the Ukrainians tried another one of their offensives in this area. They were severely beaten back by the Russian troops in the area, and they appear to have suffered severe losses. There's also, by the way, further reports of the Russians preparing some sort of counteroffensive in the Kharkiv area, countering the previous Ukrainian counteroffensive, now that the Russian redeployments have been completed in this part of the war. If that does indeed happen, and if Ukraine, of course, loses the territory that it regained over the last few weeks, well, that will presumably be a severe psychological blow for Ukraine, coming, of course, on top of all of the other failures and defeats that are now taking place on the battlefield. I want to make a very important observation. This is not the beginning of the end. It seems to me that we're starting to see increasing signs of the Ukrainian resistance in Donbass coming under such severe pressure that it is cracking, but it is not yet cracked. The Ukrainians are still resisting. They're still throwing men into trying to break the various encirclements that are taking place in Donbass. This still has some way to go. I'm not going to try and guess how long. I don't have the expertise to do so, but the direction of travel, if you like, is increasingly clear. And I would say that I remain of the view, contrary to various others, that if the Ukrainian army in Donbass is defeated and destroyed, then that will fundamentally change the entire military balance throughout Ukraine. And we will then at that point see further potential Russian offensives, perhaps after the Russians have made one further request, ultimatum more plausibly, to the Ukrainians to agree to peace talks. If the Ukrainians refuse to do that after the main army in Donbass is destroyed, well, I think that at that point we will start to see further Russian offensives, and I'm not going to even try to guess or speculate where they will be, but I suspect that at that point the tempo of the war will accelerate markedly. I would say that there is no area in Ukraine where the resistance of the Ukrainian troops would have been as intense as in Donbass. The Ukrainian troops in Donbass, by general agreement, were the best in the Ukrainian army, the best trained, the best equipped, the most motivated. And in addition, and beyond that, the fortification system that Ukraine was able to build in Donbass over the 8 years since the fighting in Donbass began in 2014 has no analogue anywhere else in Ukraine. So once this force in Donbass is destroyed, I suspect that the operational tempo of the war, on the assumption that it continues and that there isn't a diplomatic compromise, I suspect that the tempo will at that point accelerate. Anyway, that's where we are, or so it seems to me, with the latest military developments. There's been a whole lot of other developments as well. Firstly, the NATO membership bids of Sweden and Finland have now come to a juddering stop as President Erdogan of Turkey does what he always does in these situations, which is bid up his price. He apparently blocked today consideration of Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership applications, even though this was supposed to be happening today as a first start in this accelerated membership process that the United States and Britain and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had all been hoping for. And he's now made a whole series, President Erdogan has now made a whole series of extraordinary demands. Firstly, he wants radical changes in policy with respect to the Kurdish issue on the part of the Swedish and Finnish governments. Changes that are so radical that I don't know how those governments can comply with it. He also wants the F-35, Turkey to be allowed to rejoin the F-35 program, Turkey to be supplied with F-16 fighter jets. He wants a whole lot of things. He's set out an extraordinarily comprehensive and lengthy shopping list of demands, which I suspect must have been greeted in Western capitals with dismay. And I wonder exactly what Western governments are going to do, because of course, if Finland and NATO don't see their membership bids approved in June, then to be very clear about it, they are in the worst of all worlds. They will have thrown away the protection that neutrality confers on them in return for a NATO membership bid which has been rejected and which leaves them without the protections that NATO membership is supposed to provide under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So this would be a diplomatic catastrophe for the West, and it would probably be a diplomatic catastrophe for the Finns and the Swedes. And I suspect that over the next few days and weeks and months, there's going to be a protracted and intense negotiation between Western governments and President Erdogan, all of them desperately looking for ways to change his mind and perhaps and possibly trying to exploit his President Erdogan's domestic political difficulties. Turkey's going through a deep economic crisis, either to put pressure on him or, who knows, perhaps, given what an intractable character he is, to try to shunt him aside. Anyway, it's going to be a difficult and high-stakes game. But it shows once again the extraordinary lack of foresight and preparation that NATO governments, Western governments, have shown in every move that they have taken with respect to the Ukrainian crisis. I've discussed in the past how they didn't think through their sanctions policies properly and how those haven't turned out in any way as they expected. I've also suggested that their diplomatic strategies may have been misconceived, and it's now clear that they didn't think this through with respect to Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership bids. Because had they done so, had anybody given 5 minutes of consideration to this matter, they would have realised that President Erdogan is a potential problem. In fact, it is so obvious that President Erdogan might be a problem that I would have expected, in fact, I assumed before Finland and Sweden made their NATO membership bids, that President Erdogan would have been privately consulted about it and would have given the green light to it. Well, it's now blindingly clear that this was not done. So the result is that the Western powers now find themselves in a bidding war, which is, I suspect, going to take up a huge amount of their time and energy over the next few days and weeks, and one which could potentially result in severe embarrassment. Anyway, we'll see how this turns out. I still think that by hook or by crook, even if it means paying President Erdogan's exorbitant price, the Western powers will get Finland and Sweden into NATO in some way. But things I've expected to happen in that respect haven't always done so, and I'm not a gambling man anyway. At the moment, I wouldn't put any money on it. So that's the first thing to say. The second that's happened is that the Western powers seem very grudgingly to have accepted now that the oil embargo idea on Russia, the idea of banning Russian oil imports into Europe, that is a non-starter. Resistance and opposition from Hungary and from the East European states is overwhelming and cannot be bargained or pressured away. So we now have a return to Secretary of State Janet Yellen's original proposal of tariffs or price caps. Except I don't see how tariffs or price caps on Russian oil are going to work. Anybody who has any experience of tariffs or of price caps, especially of price caps, knows that in a market situation, trying to impose price caps in that sort of way not only is going to create enormous complexities and problems, but it will inevitably create further rises in prices and all kinds of speculative activities, and it will probably intensify oil shortages. In fact, neither the tariff nor the oil cap idea, the price cap idea, seem to me to be at all sensible or proper ideas. Far and away the best thing the Western powers can do is to simply drop this entire idea of an oil import ban. Everything else comes with a host of problems. It seems the Germans, who have been running with this oil import ban idea, have made it very clear that they find the ideas of tariffs and price caps unworkable. Well, they should stick to that position, because it's, as I said, going to create more problems than it solves. Since the oil import ban creates so many problems, better to drop it. And if you really do want to wean yourself off Russian oil, well, go ahead and work towards that end. Nothing prevents you. There is nothing to stop Western governments, European governments, deciding that they don't want to buy Russian oil and working with the industry, a long-term plan to achieve that. It might not make much commercial sense. It might impose price burdens upon European industries, but ultimately that's the Europeans' choice. Only do it properly. Give yourself time. It might take 2 years, it might take 5 years, it might take longer. Don't think you can do this in a few months or a few weeks or by the end of the year. Don't impose these impossible, unrealistic timetables upon yourself. It's the sort of thing that people who do not understand how long industrial processes take to turn round tend to demand, but which is unrealistic in terms of what you can plausibly expect of the industry. Anyway, these discussions are now underway. I wonder what the outcome will be. I wonder how much resistance these oil price caps and tariff ideas will come under. But, let's wait and see where it all goes. There is another piece of economic news, which is in some ways even more extraordinary. And that is that, according to Bloomberg, the US government is now planning to revoke the license that the Russian finance ministry needs in order to pay US bondholders who hold Russian bonds. Now, this is an extraordinary story, and it goes back to the sanctions that the United States and its allies, the Western powers, imposed on the Russian central bank back in February, the so-called shock and awe sanctions. I called them that when they happened, but this has now become, surely by chance or coincidence, or perhaps because the analogy is obvious, this has become now an increasingly common way of referring to these sanctions. Now, the idea of those sanctions was very carefully explained in a briefing that was given by a US administration official, of course, an anonymous US administration official, when he or she announced the sanctions against the Russian central bank. This person said that the objective was to cause the ruble to go into free fall because the Russian central bank would be unable to support the ruble by interventions in the financial currency markets. It would also mean, and this is what this official said, that the Russians would find themselves in a position where they would either have to devote scarce foreign exchange, that was the word he used, which Russia was still receiving, in order to pay bondholders, in other words, in order to avoid default, thereby causing further pressure on the ruble because there wouldn't be money to support the ruble, and or alternatively, the Russians would have to decide to go into default. So the idea was of the shock and awe sanctions to cause the ruble to crash, to force a default, Russia to go into default through failures to pay the bondholders. And as a result, the assumption was that this would lead to a chain reaction, which would bring down the entire Russian financial system. With the ruble going into free fall, there would be hyperinflation crisis within Russia. The economy would go into a tailspin that would result in protests, and President Putin and his government would eventually fall. That was, as far as I can see, the plan. Well, it hasn't turned out like that in any shape or form. Firstly, the Russians have successfully managed to keep their exports of oil, gas, whatever, going. And in fact, they've managed to force the Europeans to pay for the gas they receive in accordance with the gas for ruble scheme. And far from the ruble going into a free fall, it has steadily strengthened since an early wobble in March. Not only has the ruble strengthened, but there is now clear indications that inflationary pressures in Russia are now abating. It is quite possible that Russia could end the year with day-to-day inflation, not annualized inflation. Annualized inflation is inflation over the whole year. But I mean day-to-day inflation, in other words, rises in prices from one day to another, that is lower than that in the United States or in Europe or in Britain, where, by the way, the annualized inflation rate is now at 9%. So that hasn't happened. The ruble didn't go into a tailspin. There wasn't a hyperinflation crisis. The Russian financial system continued to operate, and Russia, far from facing scarcities of foreign currency to support the ruble, not that there's much sign that it's doing it, or to pay bondholders, now has an embarrassing excess of foreign currency. In fact, this excess of foreign currency has become so big that the Russian finance ministry has felt able to drop its plan of paying bondholders in rubles. It has in fact paid state bondholders, Russian sovereign bondholders, US bondholders, in dollars. Dollars which Russia has earned through its exports. And that was not what was supposed to happen. So the result is that the US authorities, still wanting to create some kind of default situation, are now going to use the revocation of a license, or at least the expiry of a license, to block Russian dollar payments of bondholders. Or at least that is what Bloomberg says that the US authorities are planning to do. Now, I'm going to make my own comment here. I think this is a disastrously bad idea. And I think this is a disastrously bad idea for one very specific reason. Because the reason I say is because it destroys whatever fiction there was that the Russians were unable to pay the bondholders, and that is why they were in default on their debts. That was the plan that was outlined in February. On the contrary, the Russians have all the money they need to pay the bondholders. They don't need the money that the central bank had and which has been frozen, or which the Western governments have seized. They're perfectly capable of paying the bondholders out of the enormous amount of foreign currency they have been receiving. They are in no conceivable respect in any sort of financial default. They're not in any situation where they are incapable of meeting their financial obligations. Moreover, they have shown a willingness and intention to meet their financial obligations by paying the bondholders in foreign currency. So, if the US authorities block those payments, in other words, prevent the bondholders receiving money they are entitled to receive from the Russians, which the Russians are both able and willing to pay, then it seems to me that the US government is in a potential situation where it is interfering directly in a contract, a commercial contract between the Russian state and its bondholders, in a way that leaves it open for the bondholders to bring legal action against the US government. That, it seems to me, is the legal position. I am sure that there are all kinds of intricacies, and I'm sure that the United States authorities are looking for some way to give themselves immunities on this issue. But personally, I think that this is an extremely difficult area for the US authorities. I think they may find that if they get claims from the bondholders complaining that it is the US government that is obstructing payment from the Russians, well, I think at that point the US government might have difficulties putting together a convincing defense. Anyway, that's where we are with this. Just consider the absolute obsessiveness of this. I mean, the shock and awe sanctions that were imposed in February haven't worked. They haven't caused the ruble to go into a tailspin. They haven't caused the collapse of the Russian financial system. Russia is not heading into a hyperinflation crisis. In fact, it's debatable whether Russia is even in any conceivable circumstance in default of anything. On the contrary, it seems willing and able to meet its financial obligations. So what does the United States government do? It doesn't accept that this financial shock and awe sanctions has failed. It comes up with, I think, an increasingly dangerous idea of using legal action, or at least revoking or failing to extend a license in order to punish whom precisely? The Russians? The Russians are happy to pay their bondholders, but to be straightforward about it, given the amount of money they're receiving, it doesn't really seem to me to affect them very much. It simply means that they have less money that they need to spend, and they're in a position to say that, they're not in proper default because they're willing and able to make the payments. So, not the Russians. I don't see how the Russians get punished by this. The people who are going to be punished by this move are US holders of Russian sovereign bonds. In other words, US citizens, US funds, some of which are pension funds, are going to be punished if there were ever a case of cutting your nose to spite your face. This is surely that case. Well, what it shows, again, as I've said, is the obsessive nature of what the US government, of this administration's approach to this matter. It seems to me that the US authorities, from the president down, have an extraordinary, complex obsession with Russia and with the personality of Vladimir Putin. And it is causing them to do things like dabble with price caps and tariffs, and now, in effect, punish their own bondholders, which, on any objective criterion, just don't make any sense at all. Well, the latest word is that this is still under discussion within the Treasury. I hope that wiser counsels prevail. I hope that this time the technical experts will be heeded. Little sign of that at the moment. And this very bad idea will be dropped. Sometimes you try things and they don't work. The shock and awe sanctions were one. There wasn't enough advice or consultation sought from the industries, the central banks, the financial services industries before the shock and awe sanctions were applied. There was very little understanding of the sophistication and size of the Russian economy and of the ability of the Russian governmental and central bank elite to handle these sort of problems. So it was a mistake, and it didn't work, and it's already done quite a lot of damage, and the best thing to do is to let it rest. There's never any point in doubling down on failure. What was it that Einstein is supposed to have said, though he didn't actually say it, that trying to do the same thing again and again and expecting a different result is an indicator of irrationality? Well, I think people in Washington need to put their obsessions aside, start thinking rationally, start making some sensible decisions, start acknowledging that shock and awe sanctions are not working, that sanctions altogether are not working, and that the war in Donbass, far from bleeding Russia dry, is causing the destruction of Ukraine, the country which the United States says it wants to save. That's where we are. I think that if the US were to start grasping these realities, it would follow the advice that people like Mario Draghi, the Italian Prime Minister, who apparently it now turns out was beseeching President Biden to start some kind of negotiation process with the Russians. Apparently it went much further than some of the early reports suggested. Anyway, that sort of advice ought now to be heeded. It seems it's not. It seems this administration, led by an old man who I think has the obstinacy that some old men do. I have to be careful what I say, that this administration is intent on continuing along this ruinous path in which we all seem to be trapped. Meanwhile, as I said earlier in the programme, inflation in Britain has now hit an annualised rate of 9%, and to be straightforward about it, if we really do go down the crazy road of price caps and tariffs on Russian oil, then expect it to go much, much higher. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. And remember, you can join us on other platforms, especially Rumble and Locals. And if you're watching this video on Rumble, you can go to the top of the video, press the red maroon button, and that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can join our Locals community and participate in my Locals live streams, which take place every Wednesday at 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time. 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. And of course, you can also support us by coming to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there: polo shirts, t-shirts, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, bomber jackets, all those amazing things. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's all from me today. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.